What you're about to hear is a tale so horrific, so steeped in human cruelty, that it has haunted the streets of New Orleans for nearly 2 centuries. This is not merely a ghost story whispered in the shadows of the French Quarter. This is the documented account of systematic torture, unspeakable experiments, and atrocities so vile that they shocked even the hardened society of antebellum New Orleans. This is the true story of Madame Delphine LaLaurie and the mansion of horrors that still stands today, its walls forever stained with the screams of the innocent. The year was 1834, and New Orleans was a city of contradictions. Beneath the veneer of refined society, elegant balls, and cultured sophistication lurked a darkness that few dared to acknowledge. In the heart of the French Quarter, at 1140 Royal Street, stood a magnificent 3-story mansion that would become synonymous with evil itself. Behind its elegant facade and wrought iron balconies, horrors were being perpetrated that would make the Spanish Inquisition seem merciful by comparison. Madame Marie Delphine McCarty LaLaurie was the epitome of New Orleans high society. Born into wealth and privilege in 1787, she was the daughter of Louis Barthélemy de McCarty, a prominent figure in colonial Louisiana society. Delphine, as she was known to her friends, possessed all the qualities that antebellum society valued in a woman of her station. She was beautiful, charming, well-educated, and utterly ruthless in her pursuit of social advancement. By 1834, Delphine had been married 3 times. Her first husband, Don Ramón de López y Angulo, a Spanish officer, had died under mysterious circumstances in Cuba. Her second marriage to Jean Blanc, a prominent banker and politician, had ended with his sudden death in 1816, leaving Delphine a wealthy widow with 4 children. It was her third marriage to Dr. Leonard Louis Nicholas LaLaurie in 1825 that would provide her with both the social standing and the medical knowledge that would enable her most horrific crimes. The LaLaurie mansion was a testament to wealth and taste. Purchased in 1831, the 3-story Creole mansion featured elegant galleries, ornate ironwork, and spacious rooms filled with the finest European furnishings. The couple entertained lavishly, hosting elaborate dinner parties and soirees that drew the cream of New Orleans society. Guests would arrive in their finest carriages, ascending the grand staircase to be greeted by their gracious hostess, never suspecting that beneath their feet lay chambers of unimaginable horror. Delphine LaLaurie's public persona was that of a refined and charitable woman. She was known for her generous donations to local charities, her patronage of the arts, and her seemingly kind treatment of her household slaves. Visitors to the mansion often commented on how well-dressed and well-fed the LaLaurie slaves appeared, a stark contrast to the treatment of enslaved people in many other wealthy households. This carefully cultivated image would prove to be the perfect mask for the monster that lurked beneath. The first hints of the darkness within the LaLaurie mansion came from the neighbors. Mrs. Pauline Blanchard, who lived in the adjacent property, began to notice disturbing sounds emanating from the LaLaurie house during the late hours of the night. She reported hearing screams, moaning, and what sounded like heavy objects being dragged across floors. When she mentioned these concerns to other neighbors, she was told that such sounds were not uncommon in households with large numbers of slaves, and that Madame LaLaurie was known for maintaining strict discipline. But Mrs. Blanchard's concerns deepened when she witnessed a horrific scene from her second-story window. On a sweltering August afternoon in 1833, she observed a young slave girl, no more than 12 years old, being chased across the LaLaurie mansion's roof by Madame LaLaurie herself, who was wielding a whip. The terrified child, in her desperation to escape the lashing, fell from the roof to the courtyard below, her small body striking the brick pavement with a sickening sound that Mrs. Blanchard would never forget. The girl's death was quickly covered up. Within hours, her body had been removed and buried in a shallow grave in the mansion's courtyard. When authorities were notified, Madame LaLaurie claimed that the child had been stealing and had fallen while attempting to escape punishment. The incident was officially recorded as an accident, and no further investigation was conducted. After all, Madame LaLaurie was a respected member of society, and the life of a slave child was considered of little consequence in the brutal hierarchy of antebellum New Orleans. However, the incident had consequences. A judge, responding to Mrs. Blanchard's persistent complaints, ordered that the LaLaurie's slaves be sold at auction. This should have ended Madame LaLaurie's access to victims, but her wealth and connections allowed her to circumvent the law. Through intermediaries and shell purchases, she managed to buy back most of her slaves, ensuring that her supply of victims remained intact. Dr. Leonard LaLaurie, Delphine's husband, was a man of medicine who had studied in Paris and was respected in New Orleans medical circles. However, his marriage to Delphine had changed him in disturbing ways. Colleagues noted that he had become increasingly reclusive, spending long hours in the mansion's basement and showing an unhealthy interest in what he termed experimental anatomy. His medical practice began to decline as he devoted more time to his wife's dark pursuits. The basement of the LaLaurie mansion had been converted into what could only be described as a medieval torture chamber. LaLaurie's medical knowledge, combined with his wife's sadistic creativity, had created a space where human suffering was elevated to an art form. The room was equipped with surgical tables, restraining devices, and an array of instruments that served no legitimate medical purpose. The walls were lined with shelves containing jars filled with human organs and body parts, preserved in various solutions that Dr. LaLaurie had concocted. Madame LaLaurie's experiments on her slaves were not random acts of cruelty, but systematic investigations into the limits of human endurance and the nature of pain itself. She kept detailed journals documenting her procedures, noting the subjects' reactions, the duration of their suffering, and the eventual outcomes of her interventions. These journals, which would later be discovered by authorities, revealed a mind that had descended into complete moral darkness. One of the most horrific aspects of Madame LaLaurie's crimes was her use of her own children as witnesses to her atrocities. Her daughters, Marie Delphine Francisca Borja Lopez y Angulo de la Candelaria and Marie Louise Pauline Blanc, were regularly brought to the basement to observe their mother's work. Madame LaLaurie believed that exposing her children to such scenes would strengthen their character and prepare them for the realities of maintaining power over the enslaved population. The children's reactions to these forced viewings varied. The younger daughter, Marie Louise, often became physically ill and would beg to be excused from the sessions. However, the elder daughter, Marie Delphine, showed a disturbing fascination with her mother's activities and began to assist in minor ways, holding instruments or taking notes as directed. This early exposure to extreme violence would have lasting effects on both children, shaping their adult personalities in profound and troubling ways. As 1833 turned to 1834, Madame LaLaurie's activities became increasingly bold and elaborate. She began to invite select guests to witness what she called her medical demonstrations. These individuals, carefully chosen from among New Orleans' most depraved elite, would gather in the mansion's basement to observe as Madame LaLaurie performed her grotesque experiments on living human beings. Among these witnesses was Judge François-Xavier Martin, a man whose corruption and cruelty were legendary even by New Orleans standards. Judge Martin not only observed Madame LaLaurie's activities but actively participated, suggesting new forms of torture and offering legal protection for her crimes. His presence at these gatherings ensured that any complaints or investigations would be quickly suppressed. Another regular attendee was Dr. Armand Mercier, a physician who had been expelled from medical practice in France for conducting unauthorized experiments on patients. Mercier brought his own expertise to Madame LaLaurie's basement laboratory, introducing techniques he had learned during his studies of human anatomy and his illicit research into pain tolerance. Together, the three formed a triumvirate of evil that pushed the boundaries of human cruelty to unprecedented levels. The slaves who survived Madame LaLaurie's initial experiments were subjected to increasingly elaborate forms of torture. She developed a particular fascination with surgical modification, performing operations without anesthesia that were designed not to heal but to cause maximum suffering. Limbs were removed and reattached in different positions, facial features were altered beyond recognition, and internal organs were repositioned in ways that ensured prolonged agony without immediate death. One of her most horrific creations was a slave woman whose arms had been broken and reset at impossible angles, her joints fused in positions that made any movement excruciating. The woman's mouth had been sewn shut, and her tongue had been partially removed, leaving her unable to speak or cry out. Madame LaLaurie kept this victim chained in a prominent position in the basement, using her as an example to terrorize other slaves and as entertainment for her twisted guests. Another victim had been subjected to what Madame LaLaurie called anatomical rearrangement. The slave's bones had been systematically broken and reset to create a grotesque parody of the human form. His spine had been curved into an S shape, his ribs had been repositioned to create a barrel-like chest, and his limbs had been shortened and twisted. Despite these modifications, the man remained alive, existing in a state of constant agony that served as a testament to both Madame LaLaurie's surgical skill and her complete lack of humanity. The basement also contained what Madame LaLaurie referred to as her collection, a series of preserved specimens that documented her various experiments. Jars lined the walls, containing organs, limbs, and other body parts that had been removed from her victims. Each specimen was carefully labeled with details about the subject, the procedure performed, and the duration of survival following the operation. This macabre museum served as both a record of her crimes and a source of pride in her twisted accomplishments. As winter turned to spring in 1834, Madame LaLaurie's confidence in her immunity from consequences led her to become increasingly careless. Neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the mansion's chimney at all hours, accompanied by a smell that was unmistakably that of burning flesh. Delivery men bringing supplies to the house spoke of hearing screams and moans emanating from the basement, sounds that could be heard even through the thick stone walls. The mansion's kitchen staff, who were among the few slaves allowed to move freely between the upper floors and the basement, began to show signs of severe psychological trauma. They moved through their duties like automatons, their eyes vacant and their spirits broken by the horrors they had witnessed. Several attempted to escape, but they were quickly recaptured and subjected to punishments that ensured no others would attempt to flee. Mrs. Blanchard, the neighbor who had first raised concerns about the LaLaurie household, continued to document the disturbing activities she observed. She kept a detailed diary of the sounds, smells, and sights that emanated from the mansion, creating a record that would later prove crucial in understanding the full scope of Madame LaLaurie's crimes. Her persistence in reporting these incidents, despite being dismissed by authorities, demonstrated a moral courage that was rare in a society that preferred to ignore uncomfortable truths. The breaking point came on the morning of April 10, 1834. A fire broke out in the LaLaurie mansion's kitchen, started by an elderly slave woman who had been chained to the stove as punishment for some minor infraction. Rather than face whatever tortures awaited her in the basement, the woman had deliberately set the fire, choosing death by flames over the prolonged agony that Madame LaLaurie would surely inflict upon her. The New Orleans Fire Department responded quickly to the blaze, but their efforts to fight the fire were hampered by Madame LaLaurie's refusal to provide keys to certain areas of the house. When firefighters demanded access to ensure that all occupants had been evacuated, she claimed that the basement contained only storage and that no one could possibly be trapped there. Her husband, Dr. LaLaurie, supported her claims, insisting that the basement was used solely for wine storage and medical supplies. However, the persistence of the fire chief, Captain Henri Dubois, and the suspicious behavior of the LaLauries led to a forced entry into the basement. What the firefighters discovered there would haunt them for the rest of their lives and shock even the hardened citizens of New Orleans, a city that had seen its share of violence and cruelty. The basement was a charnel house beyond imagination. 7 slaves were found chained to the walls in various states of mutilation and torture. Some had been there for months, their bodies bearing the evidence of repeated surgical procedures and systematic abuse. The stench of death, decay, and human waste was overwhelming, forcing several of the firefighters to retreat to the courtyard to vomit. The first victim they encountered was a woman whose limbs had been broken and reset in grotesque positions. Her arms had been twisted behind her back and fused to her spine, creating a permanent position of agony. Her legs had been broken at the knees and ankles, then set at impossible angles that made standing or lying down equally painful. Despite these horrific modifications, she was still alive, her eyes pleading for death as her only escape from suffering. In another corner of the basement, they found a man whose body had been subjected to what could only be described as surgical experimentation. His chest had been opened and his ribs spread apart, exposing his internal organs while somehow keeping him alive. His heart could be seen beating through the gaping wound, and his lungs struggled to function despite the damage to his chest cavity. Tubes had been inserted into various organs, apparently to study their function while the subject remained conscious. Perhaps the most horrific discovery was a slave whose face had been completely reconstructed in a grotesque parody of human features. His nose had been removed and replaced with what appeared to be animal cartilage, his lips had been sewn into a permanent grimace, and his eyes had been repositioned to create an expression of perpetual terror. The surgical skill required for such modifications was considerable, demonstrating that these were not random acts of violence but carefully planned experiments in human suffering. The firefighters also discovered evidence of Madame LaLaurie's systematic documentation of her crimes. Detailed journals described each victim, the procedures performed upon them, and their responses to various forms of torture. Sketches and diagrams illustrated the surgical modifications, showing a level of planning and premeditation that made the crimes even more heinous. These documents would later serve as crucial evidence in understanding the full scope of the atrocities committed in the mansion. As word of the discoveries spread through New Orleans, a crowd began to gather outside the LaLaurie mansion. The initial group of curious onlookers quickly grew into an angry mob as details of the basement horrors became known. Citizens who had previously admired Madame LaLaurie's charitable works and social graces now called for her immediate arrest and execution. The crowd's anger was fueled not only by the horrific nature of the crimes but also by the realization that they had been deceived for years. Many of the city's elite had dined in the LaLaurie mansion, had praised Madame LaLaurie's treatment of her slaves, and had held her up as an example of proper Southern womanhood. The discovery that they had been socializing with a monster who tortured human beings for entertainment was a blow to their self-image that many could not accept. Judge Martin, who had been one of Madame LaLaurie's co-conspirators, quickly distanced himself from the scandal. He issued a statement claiming that he had been deceived by the woman's charitable facade and had no knowledge of the basement activities. This obvious lie fooled no one, but his position in the legal system protected him from immediate consequences. Dr. Mercier, the expelled French physician who had participated in the experiments, fled the city within hours of the discovery. He boarded a ship bound for Haiti, taking with him several of Madame LaLaurie's journals and specimens. His escape denied authorities the opportunity to fully understand the medical aspects of the crimes and left many questions about the extent of the conspiracy unanswered. As the crowd outside the mansion grew larger and more violent, Madame LaLaurie and her family prepared to flee. They had maintained a carriage ready for quick departure, a precaution that suggested they had always known that discovery was possible. Under cover of darkness, they escaped through a rear entrance, making their way to the docks where a ship waited to carry them to safety. The LaLaurie family's escape was facilitated by a network of sympathizers who believed that the punishment of a white woman for crimes against slaves would set a dangerous precedent. These individuals, many of whom held prominent positions in New Orleans society, provided money, transportation, and safe passage to ensure that Madame LaLaurie would never face justice for her crimes. The ship carrying the LaLaurie family sailed for Paris, where they had connections and resources that would allow them to establish new lives. Madame LaLaurie's wealth, much of it derived from her previous husband's estates, had been carefully transferred to European banks in anticipation of such a need. Her escape was not a desperate flight but a carefully planned evacuation that had been prepared years in advance. In the days following the discovery, authorities conducted a thorough investigation of the LaLaurie mansion. They found evidence of at least 15 murders, though the actual number of victims was likely much higher. The basement contained mass graves where bodies had been hastily buried, and chemical analysis of the soil revealed traces of human remains that had been dissolved in acid. The investigation also uncovered the extent of the conspiracy that had protected Madame LaLaurie for so long. Bribes had been paid to police officials, judges had been compromised, and city officials had been bought off to ensure that complaints about the mansion were ignored or suppressed. The corruption was so extensive that it reached the highest levels of New Orleans government, making a thorough prosecution impossible. The 7 slaves who were rescued from the basement were taken to a local hospital for treatment, but their injuries were so severe that most died within days of their rescue. The psychological trauma they had endured was as devastating as their physical wounds, and those who survived were never able to fully recover from their ordeal. Their testimonies, given in their final hours, provided crucial details about the systematic nature of Madame LaLaurie's crimes. One survivor, a young man named Baptiste, managed to live for several weeks after his rescue. He provided investigators with detailed accounts of the basement activities, describing not only his own torture but also the fates of other slaves who had disappeared over the years. His testimony revealed that Madame LaLaurie had been conducting her experiments for at least 5 years, and that the basement had claimed dozens of victims. Baptiste described how new slaves brought to the mansion were initially treated well, given adequate food and clothing to maintain the illusion of Madame LaLaurie's benevolence. However, those who showed any sign of resistance or independence were quickly selected for the basement experiments. The selection process was deliberate and calculated, designed to remove potential troublemakers while maintaining the facade of a well-run household. The young man also revealed that Madame LaLaurie had forced slaves to participate in the torture of their fellow victims, using threats against family members to ensure compliance. This psychological manipulation added another layer of cruelty to her crimes, as she turned victims against each other and destroyed the bonds of community that might have provided comfort in their suffering. As news of the LaLaurie atrocities spread beyond New Orleans, it sparked outrage throughout the United States and Europe. Abolitionist newspapers seized upon the story as evidence of the inherent evil of slavery, while pro-slavery publications attempted to dismiss the crimes as the actions of a single deranged individual rather than a symptom of a broader system of oppression. The international attention focused on the case embarrassed New Orleans officials, who had hoped to contain the scandal locally. European newspapers published detailed accounts of the basement discoveries, often accompanied by graphic illustrations that shocked readers and damaged the city's reputation as a center of culture and refinement. The Catholic Church, which had previously counted Madame LaLaurie among its most generous benefactors, was forced to address the theological implications of her crimes. Church officials struggled to reconcile their teachings about human dignity with the reality of what had occurred in the mansion's basement. Some priests argued that Madame LaLaurie's actions were evidence of demonic possession, while others maintained that she was simply evil and bore full responsibility for her choices. The mansion itself became a focal point for the city's attempts to move past the scandal. Initially, there were calls to demolish the building entirely, to erase the physical reminder of the horrors that had occurred there. However, practical considerations prevailed, and the property was eventually sold to new owners who attempted to renovate and rehabilitate the structure. But the mansion seemed to resist these efforts at redemption. Workers reported strange occurrences during renovation attempts, tools would disappear, unexplained sounds would echo through the halls, and several workers claimed to see apparitions of the tortured slaves wandering the basement corridors. These reports, whether based in reality or imagination, made it difficult to find reliable contractors willing to work on the property. The basement where the atrocities had occurred proved particularly resistant to renovation. Despite multiple attempts to clean and refurbish the space, stains would reappear on the walls, and the smell of death and decay would return within days of any cleaning effort. Eventually, most owners simply sealed off the basement entirely, preferring to pretend that the space did not exist rather than confront the memories it contained. Over the years, the mansion changed hands multiple times, but no owner was ever able to fully escape the shadow of its dark history. Residents reported hearing screams in the night, seeing figures moving through the halls, and experiencing an overwhelming sense of dread that made normal life impossible. The building's reputation made it difficult to sell or rent, and it often stood empty for months or years at a time. Meanwhile, Madame LaLaurie and her family had established themselves in Paris, where they lived under assumed names and carefully crafted new identities. Madame LaLaurie's wealth allowed her to purchase a mansion in the fashionable 16th arrondissement, where she once again began to entertain and establish herself in high society. Her ability to charm and manipulate served her well in her new environment, and within a few years, she had gained acceptance among Parisian elite. However, Madame LaLaurie's fundamental nature had not changed. Reports began to circulate among the Parisian servant community about strange disappearances and unusual activities in her household. Domestic workers who took positions in her mansion often left after only a few days, claiming that the atmosphere was oppressive and that they had witnessed disturbing scenes that they could not fully explain. French authorities, alerted by American officials about Madame LaLaurie's background, began to investigate these reports. However, their efforts were hampered by the same factors that had protected her in New Orleans: wealth, social connections, and a legal system that was reluctant to seriously investigate crimes against servants and the poor. The investigation might have continued indefinitely, but Madame LaLaurie's arrogance ultimately led to her downfall. In 1849, 15 years after her escape from New Orleans, she was discovered conducting experiments on homeless individuals in the basement of her Parisian mansion. The French authorities, unlike their American counterparts, were not susceptible to bribery and social pressure, and they moved quickly to arrest her. The trial of Madame LaLaurie in Paris became an international sensation. Newspapers across Europe and America covered every detail of the proceedings, and the courtroom was packed daily with spectators eager to see the woman who had become synonymous with evil. The evidence presented during the trial revealed that her crimes in Paris had been even more systematic and elaborate than those committed in New Orleans. French investigators had discovered a basement laboratory that surpassed even the horrors of Royal Street. Madame LaLaurie had used her 15 years of freedom to refine her techniques and develop new methods of torture. The Parisian basement contained evidence of at least 30 murders, and investigators found detailed journals documenting experiments that pushed the boundaries of human endurance to previously unimaginable limits. The trial also revealed the extent to which Madame LaLaurie's children had been corrupted by their exposure to her crimes. Her elder daughter, Marie Delphine, had become an active participant in the Parisian experiments, demonstrating a level of cruelty that rivaled her mother's. The younger daughter, Marie-Louise, had suffered a complete mental breakdown and was confined to an asylum, her mind shattered by years of witnessing unspeakable horrors. Dr. LaLaurie, who had accompanied his wife to Paris, was found to have continued his role as her medical accomplice. His expertise had been crucial in keeping victims alive during prolonged torture sessions, and his journals revealed a scientific fascination with pain and suffering that was as disturbing as his wife's sadistic pleasure in inflicting it. The French court, after hearing weeks of testimony and examining hundreds of pieces of evidence, found Madame LaLaurie guilty of multiple counts of murder and torture. She was sentenced to death by guillotine, a fate that many felt was too merciful for someone who had caused such prolonged suffering to so many victims. However, Madame LaLaurie would never face the executioner's blade. On the night before her scheduled execution, she was found dead in her cell, apparently having taken poison that had been smuggled to her by unknown accomplices. Her death denied her victims the satisfaction of seeing justice served, but it also ensured that her reign of terror had finally ended. The news of Madame LaLaurie's death was received with mixed emotions in New Orleans. Many felt relief that the woman who had brought such shame to their city was finally gone, while others regretted that she had escaped the full consequences of her actions. The mansion on Royal Street, which had stood as a monument to her crimes, seemed to exhale a collective sigh of relief, as if the building itself had been waiting for news of her death. But the legacy of Madame LaLaurie's crimes extended far beyond her own life and death. The discovery of the basement horrors had exposed the brutal reality of slavery in ways that polite society had previously been able to ignore. The systematic nature of her crimes, the complicity of respected citizens, and the corruption that had protected her for so long forced many to confront uncomfortable truths about the society they had created and maintained. The case also had lasting effects on the practice of medicine in the American South. Dr. LaLaurie's participation in the crimes led to increased scrutiny of medical professionals and their treatment of enslaved patients. New regulations were implemented to prevent the abuse of medical knowledge, though enforcement remained inconsistent in a society that still viewed slaves as property rather than human beings. The psychological impact of the LaLaurie case on the enslaved community was profound and lasting. The knowledge that such horrors were possible, that respected members of society could harbor such evil intentions, created a climate of fear and suspicion that persisted long after Madame LaLaurie's death. Slaves throughout the South lived with the knowledge that any household could potentially harbor similar secrets, that any master or mistress might be capable of unimaginable cruelty. The mansion itself continued to serve as a reminder of the crimes that had occurred within its walls. Despite numerous attempts at renovation and rehabilitation, the building never fully escaped its dark reputation. Subsequent owners reported ongoing supernatural phenomena, and the property became a destination for those interested in the macabre and the unexplained. In the years following the Civil War, as New Orleans began to reckon with its past, the LaLaurie mansion became a symbol of the horrors of slavery and the need for justice and reconciliation. Former slaves and their descendants would sometimes gather outside the building to remember those who had suffered and died there, creating an informal memorial to the victims of Madame LaLaurie's cruelty. The building's basement, where the worst atrocities had occurred, was eventually sealed permanently. City officials decided that the space was too contaminated by its history to ever be safely used again. The decision to seal the basement was both practical and symbolic, representing society's desire to bury the darkest chapters of its past while acknowledging that some wounds could never fully heal. Modern historians and criminologists have studied the LaLaurie case extensively, seeking to understand how such systematic cruelty could have been perpetrated and concealed for so long. Their research has revealed that Madame LaLaurie's crimes were not the isolated actions of a single disturbed individual, but rather the extreme manifestation of a society that had dehumanized an entire race of people and created systems that enabled and protected such abuse. The case has also been examined by psychologists seeking to understand the development of extreme antisocial behavior. Madame LaLaurie's ability to maintain a facade of respectability while conducting systematic torture has been studied as an example of how psychopathic individuals can manipulate social systems to protect themselves while pursuing their destructive impulses. Recent archaeological investigations of the mansion's grounds have uncovered additional evidence of Madame LaLaurie's crimes. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed multiple burial sites in the courtyard and surrounding areas, suggesting that the number of victims was even higher than previously estimated. These discoveries have provided new insights into the scope and duration of the atrocities, confirming that the basement horrors were only the visible portion of a much larger pattern of systematic murder and torture. The LaLaurie mansion today stands as a complex symbol of New Orleans' complicated relationship with its past. The building has been converted into luxury condominiums, with wealthy residents living in spaces that once witnessed unimaginable horrors. This transformation reflects the city's ongoing struggle to balance historical preservation with the need to move forward and create new narratives for itself. Tour guides in the French Quarter still tell the story of Madame LaLaurie and her mansion of horrors, though the accounts vary widely in their accuracy and emphasis. Some focus on the supernatural aspects of the story, treating it as a ghost tale designed to thrill tourists. Others attempt to provide historical context, using the case to educate visitors about the realities of slavery and the importance of confronting difficult truths about the past. The victims of Madame LaLaurie's crimes have largely been forgotten by history, their names and stories lost to time and deliberate erasure. This anonymity reflects the broader pattern of how enslaved people were treated in historical records, their individual humanity subsumed into the larger narrative of their oppression. Efforts by modern historians to recover and honor these lost lives have been hampered by the destruction of records and the passage of time. However, some progress has been made in recent years to acknowledge and memorialize the victims. Local historical societies have worked to research and document the lives of the enslaved people who suffered in the LaLaurie mansion, attempting to restore their humanity and ensure that they are remembered as individuals rather than simply as victims of a notorious crime. The influence of the LaLaurie case extends beyond historical and academic circles into popular culture, where it has inspired countless books, films, and television shows. These fictional treatments often sensationalize the story, focusing on supernatural elements while minimizing the historical context and the real suffering of the victims. This commercialization of tragedy reflects broader societal discomfort with confronting the full reality of historical atrocities. Educational institutions have also grappled with how to teach the LaLaurie case in ways that honor the victims while providing important lessons about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of protecting vulnerable populations. The challenge lies in presenting the historical facts without gratuitous sensationalism while ensuring that students understand the broader social and political contexts that enabled such crimes. The legal legacy of the LaLaurie case has influenced the development of laws protecting vulnerable populations and regulating medical experimentation. The systematic nature of Dr. LaLaurie's participation in the crimes highlighted the potential for medical knowledge to be used for harmful purposes, leading to the development of ethical guidelines and oversight mechanisms that continue to evolve today. International human rights organizations have cited the LaLaurie case as an early example of crimes against humanity, noting how the systematic torture and murder of enslaved people prefigured later atrocities committed by totalitarian regimes. This historical perspective helps to place the crimes in a broader context of human rights violations and the ongoing struggle to protect vulnerable populations from abuse. The mansion's current residents live with the daily reminder of its dark history, though their experiences vary widely. Some report no unusual phenomena and view the building simply as a beautiful historic property. Others describe ongoing supernatural encounters that they attribute to the restless spirits of Madame LaLaurie's victims. These varying experiences reflect different levels of sensitivity to the building's history and different ways of processing traumatic historical events. Paranormal investigators continue to be drawn to the LaLaurie mansion, conducting seances and ghost hunts in attempts to communicate with the spirits of the victims. While these activities are often dismissed as pseudoscience, they reflect a genuine desire to acknowledge the suffering that occurred in the building and to provide some form of recognition to those who died there. The basement of the mansion, though sealed, continues to exert a powerful influence on the building's atmosphere. Residents and visitors often report feeling an overwhelming sense of dread when near the sealed entrance, and some claim to hear sounds emanating from the closed-off space. Whether these experiences are psychological responses to the known history or genuine supernatural phenomena, they demonstrate the lasting impact of the atrocities committed there. Modern forensic techniques have been applied to evidence preserved from the original investigation, providing new insights into Madame LaLaurie's methods and the extent of her crimes. DNA analysis of preserved tissue samples has confirmed the systematic nature of the torture and has provided evidence of previously unknown victims. These scientific advances have helped to validate historical accounts and have provided additional evidence of the scope of the atrocities. The case has also been studied by experts in trauma and recovery, who have examined how communities heal from collective traumatic experiences. The long-lasting effects of the LaLaurie crimes on New Orleans' African American community have been documented, showing how historical atrocities can have intergenerational impacts that persist long after the original events. Contemporary discussions about reparations and historical justice often reference the LaLaurie case as an example of crimes for which no adequate restitution was ever made. The wealth that enabled Madame LaLaurie's crimes was built on the exploitation of enslaved labor, and her escape from justice meant that no compensation was ever provided to the victims' families or communities. The mansion's location in the heart of the French Quarter ensures that it remains a visible reminder of New Orleans' complex history. The building's elegant facade and prime location make it valuable real estate, but its dark history continues to influence how it is perceived and used. This tension between historical significance and commercial value reflects broader challenges in dealing with sites associated with historical atrocities. Recent efforts to install historical markers and educational displays near the mansion have met with mixed reactions from the community. Some support these initiatives as important steps toward acknowledging and learning from the past, while others worry that they will sensationalize the crimes and exploit the victims' suffering for tourism purposes. The story of Madame LaLaurie and her mansion of horrors serves as a powerful reminder of the capacity for evil that can exist within seemingly civilized society. Her crimes were enabled by a system that dehumanized enslaved people and protected those with wealth and social status from accountability. The case demonstrates how institutional racism and economic inequality can create conditions that allow systematic abuse to flourish unchecked. The lasting impact of the LaLaurie case extends far beyond the walls of the mansion on Royal Street. It has influenced literature, law, medicine, and social policy, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of protecting vulnerable populations. The case continues to resonate today as societies around the world grapple with their own histories of oppression and abuse. The victims of Madame LaLaurie's crimes may have been forgotten by history, but their suffering was not meaningless. Their deaths exposed the brutal reality of slavery and forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about the systems of oppression that it had created and maintained. In this way, their sacrifice contributed to the eventual abolition of slavery and the ongoing struggle for human rights and dignity. The mansion itself stands as a monument to both the worst and best of human nature. While it witnessed unimaginable cruelty and suffering, it also serves as a reminder of the importance of bearing witness to historical atrocities and learning from the past. The building's continued existence ensures that the story of Madame LaLaurie and her victims will not be forgotten, even as new generations struggle to understand and process its lessons. As we conclude this journey into one of history's darkest chapters, we are reminded that the capacity for both great evil and great good exists within human nature. The story of Madame LaLaurie serves as a warning about what can happen when power goes unchecked and when society fails to protect its most vulnerable members. But it also demonstrates the importance of courage in the face of evil, as shown by neighbors like Mrs. Blanchard who refused to remain silent in the face of injustice. The mansion on Royal Street continues to stand today, its elegant facade hiding the memories of unspeakable horrors. Visitors to New Orleans can still see the building where Madame LaLaurie conducted her reign of terror, though few fully comprehend the magnitude of the suffering that occurred within its walls. The building serves as a tangible link to a dark chapter in American history, a reminder that the past is never truly past and that the consequences of historical atrocities continue to reverberate through time. If this harrowing tale of human cruelty and the dark secrets hidden behind the facade of respectability has left you questioning the depths of evil that can lurk in the most unexpected places, please show your support by hitting that like button. Your engagement helps us continue to uncover these forgotten chapters of history that remind us why we must remain vigilant against injustice in all its forms. And if you haven't already joined our community of truth seekers here at the Bayou Nightmares, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We delve deep into the shadows of history every week, bringing you stories that mainstream sources often overlook or sanitize. From the haunted bayous of Louisiana to the dark corners of human nature, we explore the mysteries that shaped our world. It's important to remember that while the stories we share on the Bayou Nightmares are carefully researched and based on historical accounts, they are presented as entertainment and educational content. Some elements may be dramatized or interpreted through the lens of folklore and legend, though they are often inspired by real events and genuine human experiences that deserve to be remembered and understood. Until we meet again in the shadows of history, keep questioning the official narratives, keep seeking the truth behind the legends, and remember that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who walk among us wearing the masks of respectability. This has been the Bayou Nightmares, where the past never truly dies, and the darkest secrets eventually find their way to the light.